ocean is the final frontier on Earth. We have mapped the surface of the Moon and the red plains of Mars. But 95% of our own oceans remain a total mystery. It is a world of crushing pressure, freezing temperatures, and absolute eternal darkness. When you descend past 1,000 feet, the sun disappears completely. You enter the midnight zone. Here, the weight of the water above you is enough to crush a steel submarine like a soda can. Humans were never meant to survive down here. We are fragile balloons of air and bone in a world of heavy black liquid. But for a very specific type of person, the deep sea is their office. Saturation divers are the elite of the elite. They live for weeks in pressurized chambers, breathing a mixture of helium and oxygen, performing dangerous repairs on oil rigs and underwater cables thousands of feet below the surface. They are the loneliest people on the planet, and sometimes, in that absolute loneliness, they realize they aren't an Apos T actually alone. This is Chapter 1, The Diving Bell Trap. In the autumn of 2016, a veteran saturation diver named Chris was working on a deep-sea oil platform in the North Sea. He and his partner, Danny, were tasked with repairing a damaged valve on the seabed, nearly 800 feet below the waves. To get to the bottom, they used a diving bella, heavy, pressurized steel capsule that acts as an elevator to the abyss. The bell is connected to the main ship by a thick umbilical cord. This cord is their only lifeline. It provides their air, their heat, their communication, and their light. If that cord breaks, the diver has less than 5 minutes of emergency air in the tanks on their back. It was 2 a.m. on the surface. Chris and Danny were inside the bell, descending into the dark. The water outside the thick portholes turned from blue to gray, and then to a thick, suffocating black. They reached the seabed. The powerful floodlights on the diving bell illuminated a small circle of gray silt and twisted metal. Everything else was a void. Chris checked his equipment and stepped out of the bell. He felt the weight of the 800 feet of water pressing against his suit. Every movement was slow, like moving through thick honey. Danny stayed inside the bell to monitor the life support and handle the heavy tools. Chris walked 20 feet away from the bell to reach the broken valve. He was working in a small bubble of light, surrounded by a wall of darkness that seemed to swallow his very existence. He had been working for 30 minutes when the disaster happened. Above them, on the surface, a freak storm hit the support ship. A massive wave slammed into the hull, causing the ship to drift violently. The tension on the umbilical cord reached its breaking point. Chris heard a sound that no diver ever wants to hear. A sharp, metallic snap that echoed through his helmet. Suddenly, his primary air supply cut off. The heating in his suit died instantly. His helmet lights flickered and went black. He was in total darkness, 800 feet below the world. He frantically reached for his emergency air valve. He turned it, and a thin stream of cold, dry air hit his lungs. He had 5 minutes. He turned back toward where the diving bell should be. But there was no light. The umbilical cord had also powered the bell's floodlights. He started crawling through the silt, his hands searching for the metal frame of the bell. He was hyperventilating, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. He found the metal leg of the bell. He climbed up and pulled himself into the hatch. Danny was already there, huddled in the dark. They were trapped. No power, no heat, no light. Just the emergency battery-powered radio that was hissing with static. The temperature inside the bell began to drop. In the deep sea, the water is just above freezing. Without the heated water circulating through their suits, they would die of hypothermia long before they ran out of air. Chris and Danny sat in the pitch black, huddled together to share body warmth. The silence was absolute, but then Chris felt a vibration. It wasn't an APOS, a mechanical vibration from the ship above. It was a physical impact. Something had just hit the side of the heavy steel diving bell. Clang. The sound was sharp and clear, vibrating through the metal walls and into their bones. Danny whispered through his radio, "Chris, did you hear that?" Chris didn't, and Apos, answer. He was staring at the thick glass porthole. Even in the dark, he could see that something was blocking the faint bioluminescence of the deep-sea plankton outside. Then came the second sound. It was an Apos. It hit this time. It was a knock, 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 knock. 3 slow, rhythmic raps on the thick steel hull. It sounded exactly like a human hand knocking on a front door. But they were 800 feet underwater. There were no other divers for hundreds of miles. Chris reached for his small emergency flashlight and flicked it on. The beam was weak, but it cut through the dark. He pointed the light at the porthole. Pressed against the glass was a hand. It looked human, but it was far too large. The skin was a pale, translucent gray, like a dead fish. The fingers were long and spindly, ending in sharp, blackened nails. There was no glove. There was no suit. And as Chris watched, the fingers curled, scratching slowly against the glass. Screech. The sound was unbearable. Danny started to scream, a raw, primal sound of terror. The thing outside the glass didn't move. It just stayed there, its pale hand resting on the window, while the scratching sound continued on the other side of the bell. Chris and Danny sat there for 3 hours in the freezing dark, listening to the rhythmic knocking and the scratching. They knew that whatever was out there, it wasn't trying to get in. It was just letting them know that it was waiting for them to die. By the time the rescue divers reached them 4 hours later, Chris and Danny were unconscious from hypothermia. The rescue team reported something strange. When they approached the diving bell, they saw deep, jagged scratch marks in the thick steel hole marks that couldn't have been made by any known marine animal or equipment. Chris and Danny survived, but they never went back into the water. Chris still wakes up in the middle of the night, convinced he can hear 3 slow knocks on his bedroom window. We think of the ocean as a place of nature and beauty, but the abyss is a place of memory and hunger. And when you descend into the dark, you are stepping into a world that has been waiting for millions of years for something new to play with. When we return in Chapter 2, we will leave the diving bell behind and explore the ghost ships of the Atlantic, places where the crew vanished in an instant, leaving behind a silence that is still screaming. Welcome back. In Chapter 1, we felt the crushing pressure of the midnight zone and the terrifying realization that something follows us in the deep. But not every nightmare happens thousands of feet below the surface. Sometimes the horror floats right on top of the water, illuminated by the cold light of the moon. The Atlantic Ocean is a graveyard of wood, iron, and lost souls. For centuries, sailors have returned with stories of Mary Celeste, the Joyta, and the Cast-2 vessels found drifting aimlessly, perfectly intact, but with every single crew member missing. No signs of a struggle, no blood. Just empty rooms and half-eaten meals on the table. This is Chapter 2, The Ghost Ships of the Atlantic. In January of 2024, a salvage tugboat called the Northern Star was patrolling the remote waters near the Azores, 1,000 miles off the coast of Portugal. The crew consisted of 5 experienced sailors, led by Captain Elias, a man who had spent 40 years on the water and claimed he had seen everything the sea had to throw at him. Around 4 in the morning, the radar operator detected a large metallic signature drifting 5 miles to their north. It wasn't transmitting a distress signal. It wasn't answering radio calls. As the sun began to rise through a thick, gray sea fog, the Northern Star approached the vessel. It was a massive, modern cargo ship called the Silver Horizon. The ship was listing slightly to the left, but otherwise it looked brand new. There were no scorch marks, no holes in the hull, and all the lifeboats were still securely tucked into their cradles. Captain Elias decided to send a 3-man boarding party to investigate. Among them was the ship's mechanic, Liam. They climbed the pilot's ladder and stepped onto the massive steel deck. The silence was the first thing they noticed. On a ship this size, there should be the hum of generators, the vibration of engines, or at least the sound of the wind whistling through the rigging. But the Silver Horizon was dead. Liam and the team walked toward the bridge. The heavy steel door was unlocked. Inside, they found the captain's logbook open on the desk. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. It read, "The fog is not outside. It is inside. We cannot hear the sea anymore." Liam walked down to the galley, the ship's kitchen. He pushed open the swinging doors. On the stove, a large pot of coffee was still warm. 3 plates of scrambled eggs and toast sat on the long wooden table. One of the forks was still standing upright in a pile of eggs, as if the person holding it had simply evaporated in a split second. The air in the galley felt thick and unnaturally cold. Liam noticed that all the clocks on the wall had stopped at exactly 3:14 a.m. He moved toward the engine room, descending the narrow metal stairs into the bowels of the ship. The lower he went, the louder a specific sound became. It wasn't an engine. It was a low, rhythmic thumping. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like a massive heart beating somewhere deep inside the steel hull. Liam reached the engine room floor. It was flooded with 6 inches of oily water. He shined his flashlight across the massive pistons and gears. The water was vibrating. Liam looked toward the far corner of the room, where the massive propeller shaft connected to the engine. Standing in the shadows was a figure. Liam yelled out, "Hello! Is anyone there? We are here to help." The figure didn't an apples a T move. Liam walked closer, the oily water splashing around his boots. As his flashlight beam hit the figure, he realized it was an Appos T, a crew member. It was a collection of objects, dozens of the crew and Appos S personal items, boots, watches, family photos, and wedding rings had been piled into a perfect 6-foot-tall pyramid in the center of the engine room. And at the very top of the pyramid was the captain and Appos S gold hat standing perfectly straight. Suddenly, the low thumping sound stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy that Liam and Appos' ears began to ring. Then he heard a voice. It was in an Appos T coming from the room. It was coming from inside his own head. The voice was a chorus of dozens of people, all whispering at once. It said, "The abyss does not just take, it replaces." Liam spun around. He looked at the oily water on the floor. The reflection in the water didn't an Appos T showed the engine room ceiling. It showed a clear, bright sky and a beautiful green island that he had never seen before. He looked back at the pyramid of personal items. It was gone. In its place stood a tall, slender shadow that seemed to be made of moving water. Liam didn't an Appos T wait. He scrambled up the metal stairs, screaming for the other boarding members to get off the ship. They didn't an Appos T asked questions. They jumped into their skiff and raced back to the northern star. As they pulled away, Liam looked back at the silver horizon. The thick gray fog was rising from the deck of the cargo ship, not from the sea. The fog was dark, almost black, and it seemed to be reaching out with long, misty fingers toward their tugboat. Within minutes, the silver horizon simply vanished into the fog. The radar on the northern star went blank. There was no trace of the ship. When they returned to port and reported the encounter, the authorities told them the silver horizon had been reported lost at sea over 20 years ago. The ship Liam had stepped on, with its warm coffee and fresh eggs, shootin' and apples, tea, have existed. We think of ghost ships as empty shells, but the ocean is a master of imitation. Sometimes the sea finds a ship it likes, and it keeps it perfectly preserved, like a fly in amber. And anyone who steps on board becomes part of the collection. When we return in Chapter 3, we will leave the surface and travel to the deepest place on Earth, the Mariana Trench, a place where the pressure is so great that even the ghosts are crushed into something new. Welcome back. We have walked the decks of ships that should not exist and felt the cold breath of the deep sea on a diving bell window. But now we must go deeper. We are leaving the sunlight zone, the twilight zone, and even the midnight zone behind. We are heading to the Hadal zone, named after Hades, the god of the underworld. This is the Mariana Trench, a crescent-shaped scar in the Earth's crust that plunges nearly 7 miles straight down. If you dropped Mount Everest into the trench, its peak would still be over a mile underwater. The pressure at the bottom is 8 tons per square inch. It is equivalent to having an elephant stand on your thumb. Scientists tell us that only specialized life forms can survive here. Small, translucent fish and tiny crustaceans. But the ocean is vast, and our cameras have only seen a fraction of the darkness. This is Chapter 3, the Mariana Trench Mystery. In the summer of 2025, a private oceanic research firm launched a mission called Project Erebus. They used a state-of-the-art, unmanned deep-sea lander equipped with ultra-high-definition cameras and sensitive hydrophones to record the sounds of the Challenger Deep, the very bottom of the trench. The lander took 5 hours to reach the seabed. As the powerful LED lights flickered on, the scientists in the control room on the surface cheered. They saw a flat, desolate landscape of fine white silt. It looked like the surface of another planet. For the first 6 hours, everything was normal. They recorded small amphipods and the occasional snailfish drifting by. But then, the hydrophones picked up a sound. It wasn't the sound of water or tectonic plates. It was a rhythmic, metallic grinding. GRRR-clink dot GRRR-clink. The sound was coming from somewhere just beyond the reach of the lander's lights. The lead scientist, a man named Dr. Eris, ordered the lander to rotate its primary camera toward the sound. As the lens turned, the silt on the seafloor began to swirl, as if something massive was moving underneath the sand. Suddenly, a massive object entered the frame. It wasn't a whale. It wasn't a giant squid. It looked like a massive, rusted iron chain. Each link was the size of a small car. The chain stretched from the darkness on the left, across the seafloor, and vanished into the abyss on the right. The chain was moving. It was being pulled slowly, inch by inch, by something deeper in the trench. The team in the control room went silent. There should be no man-made objects at this depth. No ship in history had a chain that large. Dr. Aries whispered to the technician to zoom in on the chain links. As the camera focused, they saw that the metal wasn't rusted by salt water. It was covered in strange, glowing carvings that looked like a language no human had ever seen. Then, the grinding sound stopped. The silence that followed was heavy. On the monitors, the scientists watched as a massive shadow fell over the lander. Something was hovering directly above them, blocking the lights. A single, massive eye opened in the darkness above the lander. It wasn't a biological eye. It was a lens made of a dark, crystalline material that reflected the lander's own LED lights back at the camera. The lens was at least 10 feet wide. Through the hydrophone, a voice spoke. It didn't use words. It was a series of mathematical tones, a sequence of frequencies that caused the metal frame of the lander to vibrate and crack. The internal temperature of the lander began to rise rapidly. The electronics started to melt. On the surface, the monitors began to flicker with static. But right before the feed cut out, the lander captured one final image. The massive chain wasn't just lying on the floor. It was attached to a structure, a gateway made of the same dark, crystalline material, standing hundreds of feet tall in the middle of the trench. The gate was slowly opening, and from inside the gate, a light was shining. A bright, golden light that should not exist in a world that has been dark for 4 billion years. The lander imploded a second later. Project Erebus was officially shut down the following week. The data was classified by the government, and the scientists were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. But one of the technicians leaked a single frame of the footage before it was deleted. The image shows the gate, the chain, and a silhouette standing in the golden light. The silhouette is shaped like a human, but it is 20 feet tall, and it is wearing a suit that looks like a blend of ancient armor and advanced technology. We look to the stars to find alien life. We build telescopes to search for signals from distant galaxies. But perhaps we have been looking in the wrong direction. Perhaps the visitors didn't come from above. Perhaps they have been here all along, waiting at the bottom of the world, guarding a door that we were never meant to find. When we return for our fourth and final chapter, we will leave the abyss and look at the most terrifying reality of all. The things that follow us back to the surface. The submarine knock. Welcome to our final chapter. We have descended into the crushing depths. We have seen the chains that hold the world together and the gates that were never meant to be opened. We have learned that the abyss is not empty. It is a library of things that the sun has forgotten. But there is one final horror, the horror of the return. Because the ocean does not like to let go of what it has seen. Sometimes, when you climb back toward the light, something decides to climb with you. This is Chapter 4, The Submarine Knock. In the late 1990s, a research submarine called the Deep Seeker was performing a routine survey of the continental shelf off the coast of Alaska. The crew consisted of 3 people: a pilot, a navigator, and a marine biologist. They were at a depth of 4,000 feet. It was a standard mission. They were collecting soil samples and recording the movement of deep-sea currents. Around 5 in the morning, the pilot noticed a strange drag on the submarine's engines. The vessel was slowing down, even though the power output was at maximum. It felt as if something was holding onto the back of the submarine. The navigator checked the external cameras. The feed was dark, but the infrared sensors showed a massive heat signature clinging to the outside of the hull. It was shaped like a sprawling, multi-limbed shadow. The pilot decided to abort the mission and begin an emergency ascent. He blew the ballast tanks, and the submarine began to rise rapidly toward the surface. As they passed 2,000 feet, the dragging sensation stopped. The crew breathed a sigh of relief. They thought they had simply brushed against a massive piece of kelp or a giant squid that had eventually let go. But then, the sound started. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was a rhythmic, heavy pounding on the top of the hatch. Bang, bang, bang. The steel hull of the submarine vibrated with each hit. It sounded as if someone was standing on top of the sub with a sledgehammer, trying to break their way in. The marine biologist looked at the pressure gauge. They were still at 1,500 feet. No human could survive outside the hull. No known animal had the strength to strike a reinforced steel hatch with that much force. Then, the pounding stopped. A moment later, a face appeared at the small, circular porthole in the hatch. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't a monster. It was a human face. But the skin was as white as bone, and the eyes were missing, replaced by 2 glowing, bioluminescent orbs. The mouth was open in a silent, jagged scream, and the teeth were long, translucent needles made of glass. The creature pressed its face against the thick acrylic glass of the porthole. It didn't move. It just stared at them as the submarine continued to rise. When the Deep Seeker finally broke the surface and the support ship arrived to recover them, the creature was gone. But when the engineers inspected the submarine on the deck of the ship, they found something that terrified them. The heavy steel hatch was covered in deep, human-sized handprints. The metal had been heated so intensely by the creature's touch that it had partially melted and then reformed, leaving the permanent shape of long, clawed fingers burned into the hatch. The crew of the Deep Seeker never spoke about the incident publicly. The submarine was decommissioned and sold for scrap within a month. But the marine biologist left a final note in her private journal. She wrote, "We think we are exploring the ocean, but we are actually just visiting a graveyard. And when you disturb the dead, they follow you home." Over the last 60 minutes, we have traveled from the surface to the deepest cracks in the Earth's crust. We have seen the ghost ships, the ancient gates, and the things that knock in the dark. The ocean covers 70% of our planet. It is the heart of our world. But it is a heart made of cold, black water and ancient secrets. The next time you stand on the beach and look out at the horizon, remember this. The water you see is just a thin blue veil. Beneath it lies the abyss, and the abyss is always watching. Thank you for joining us on this 1-hour journey into the deep. If you made it to the very end, tell us in the comments. Are you brave enough to go where the light never reaches? If you want more deep dives into the dark and the unknown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stay safe, stay dry, and never look back at the water. I will see you in the next nightmare.